Thank you for joining us for a discussion today about business and labor in the industrial era or in the Gilded Age. We're going to examine some of the aspects of business, how the leaders of those industries made their money, how they treated their workers, and of course the reaction of the workers to their treatment. So speaking of that treatment, think about this and comment below with an emoji. How would you feel if you worked 60 hours a week for $5 an hour? This is in today's money. So think about that for a second and comment below. On the other hand, how would the owner feel if you worked 60 hours a week for $5 an hour? Again, comment with that emoji. My guess is that they're going to be very different from each other. That situation really exemplifies what's happening during the Gilded Age in terms of business and business practices. Okay, so first we can talk about the rise of industrial America. How did we get to be who we are? Well, for industrialization to happen on a large scale, you need several things. First, you need natural resources, right? Those are the raw materials that go into whatever you're making. Things like iron that can be turned into steel, which is then used throughout various industries. You need a workforce. Unskilled and semi-skilled laborers were really what was needed during this time period for factory work. You need capital. In this case, when we talk about capital, we're talking about money. If you have a great business idea, but you don't have any money to build the factory or to pay your workers, nothing's going to get done, right? Similarly, you need to have that idea by being an entrepreneur. It doesn't do you any good to produce a lot of things if no one wants to buy them, right? So you need a market for your goods, and that market will increase as America's population increased. And the last one you don't necessarily need, but it's helpful if the government is willing to take policies that will stimulate economic growth. So, a couple things to know. The railroad got started before the Civil War, but really came into its heyday after the war as America built miles, and miles of railroad using tons of steel for those rails. You can see the stats before the Civil War and just 35 years after the Civil War. And one of the big names to know in railroad is Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, Vanderbilt will make a lot of money through shipping and owning railroad lines, scooping them up, but he also has to have things to transport, right? Those materials, those goods that we talked about earlier. We can see from here railroads, how they crisscross the nation. Just after the Civil War, we had one transcontinental railroad, right? Well, look, in less than 15 years, look how many railroads now go out west. If you look at the Midwest, at Lake Michigan, you'll note that Chicago is where a lot of these railroad lines either terminated or went through on their way to other places. This will allow Chicago to grow like never before. And then something unique that we have because of the railroads, you can see on this map, are time zones. Now here's the deal. Think about transportation before railroads. You pretty much walked or you took a horse, right? Well, you're not going to get there very fast, and you weren't that worried about time. So if you were going from, say, Dallas to Fort Worth, that might take you the better part of a day. And you would just say to someone, hey, I'll meet you at sundown, or I'll meet you at noon. And because of that, during that time, and it's kind of hard to think about with today's rationale, but every single city had its own specific time based on where the sun was. Noon was always when the sun was directly overhead. Well, if you're in Dallas or you're in Fort Worth, those two times are not necessarily the same, right? As the sun transits across the sky. But because of railroads, we needed precise timekeeping so that those schedules could be kept. And the railroad lines come up with these major time zones for not only the United States, but they're then adopted worldwide. Okay, who are a few of these other robber barons or industrial titans. First, there's Andrew Carnegie, and he builds a steel empire. He figured out, or he didn't figure out, but he brought from Europe the process of turning iron into steel cheaply. Steel had been made before by human beings, going back to like medieval swords, but it was very expensive and very time consuming. Carnegie figures out how to make it cheaply, like we said before, right? With that will then come a market and a demand for them. And we'll see what some of those items are in just a little bit. Rockefeller is huge in the oil business. He's going to need, or he'll use his wherewithal to buy multiple oil companies to consolidate them into one. A lot of people accuse him of underhanded practices. That's definitely a good argument to be made. And then finally, another industry titan is J.P. Morgan, and that's maybe a name that you've heard of. His bank, his banks were pivotal throughout the United States, and it's still around today as J.P. Morgan Chase is the full name of the company. So if you have a Chase credit card, you have something in common with J.P. Morgan back 150 years ago. Okay, so like we said, Carnegie comes up with a new way of producing steel. He also used some unique strategies inside of his factories. So he had top of the line, up to date equipment that'll make him more efficient. He'll use cheaper production methods to benefit his bottom line. Instead of paying workers in salary, he often paid them in stock. That's something that still happens today with a lot of bigger companies. And think about that. You're getting them to buy into your company, right? So maybe they have a more vested interest in wanting to work harder to ensure that the company succeeds so that they in turn succeed. He encouraged competition among workers, having them find better ways to speed up the process, to make it more efficient, to make everything better. And of course, that doesn't really cost him much, except maybe a small bonus, but it reaps huge rewards for his business model. And then he practiced vertical and horizontal integration. We'll see what those are in just a minute. So like we said with Rockefeller, he controlled the oil industry. This is a pretty famous cartoon. Take a look and just kind of note a few things on there. We have this octopus who's got his arms grabbing multiple people. Looks like the US Capitol building, maybe a state capitol building. You see the White House over there. And Morgan is able to use trusts and horizontal integration to control 90% of the oil market. So let's talk about some terms real quick. I know we've all played Monopoly, and that's maybe the one definition that we're most familiar with. A monopoly, mono, means one. So when one company controls everything in that sector, that's a monopoly. Can you think of any modern monopolies today? We really don't have any. We have some duopolies, perhaps. I mean, in terms of operating systems for our phones, right? There's Android and there's Apple. But we really don't have monopolies today because the government has discouraged them based on some of the abuses that happened during this time period. A merger, I'm sure we've heard of that. That's when you're buying out a company and merging it with your own to make your company bigger. And then finally, there's a trust. So with a trust, stockholders turn over control of their company to trustees, and those trustees run the corporation. But what also happens in a trust is you might have several different businesses in that industry cooperating as one. So they're not literally a monopoly, but they're cooperating to, say, share knowledge or to raise prices together. Think about it, right? If you have two gas stations across the street from each other, usually one lowers their price and the other one might lower it a little bit more, right? Because they're trying to get you to come in to their gas station. Well, trust is kind of the opposite. That would be where they're competing or colluding together to raise the prices. What if both of those gas station owners said, you know what, let's just raise it 10 cents a gallon, right? What are people going to do? They don't have any other option. So that's a sneaky aspect that trust will affect in the United States. All right, so horizontal integration. Vertical integration, we'll get to horizontal in a second. Vertical integration is when a company owns all aspects of the manufacturing process, from the raw materials to even getting it to you to the store. So in our picture example, we have the beef industry, right? This make believe meat industry owns the cattle, the feedlots, the slaughterhouse. They own the transportation to get it to the store, and then they might even own the store, or perhaps they don't own the store, but they do have tremendous clout that they can use in their store to influence the prices. A modern example of that today is IKEA, if you think about it. You can't buy IKEA furniture anywhere except for IKEA, right? So they control where you're getting your product. Moving backwards, they own the factories that produce their products, so they're not having to worry about what happens if one factory decides they don't want to work with us anymore. And going back even further, IKEA even owns the forests where they are getting the raw materials, in this case, the wood, to make into particle board or whatever they're making their furniture out of. So it's a very efficient process, right? If you own everything, you're not as dependent on middlemen because there are no middlemen controlling other costs. Okay, horizontal integration is when you buy out your competitors. If you buy every single competitor up, you have a monopoly. But in a few cases, you might just have two or three companies controlling one aspect. So we have our example on the screen, the House of Mouse, Disney, right? Over time, they've bought up several different competitors, and now they're a behemoth, even more than they were before, in the entertainment industry. So they own obviously not just the Disney movies, but what, maybe 15 years ago, they bought out Marvel Studios. Another 10 years ago, they bought out Fox. They own ESPN. They own ABC, the station. And this is really one way that a company can have almost complete control of a market. Think for a second, what would be bad about this horizontal integration? How might that harm consumers, or in our case, moviegoers or streamers? There's less competition, they can always raise the price, right? And that's a huge fear. That goes on today when companies want to merge. The government has to approve it, say yes or no. And the idea is based on competition lowering prices. Okay, so how do these owners justify their wealth? These are people who have more money than we can even comprehend. If you look at the richest human beings of all time, several of the robber barons from this time period would be in the top 10. Definitely something fun to Google when you get done with this presentation. Okay, so one thing that they used to justify their success was this idea of social Darwinism. We know that in biology, right, Darwin talked about survival of the fittest, that the fittest specimens passed on their genes to the next generation, and so that they would thrive. That idea also in this case applied to society. Now, what they're saying at first is the people who are the most naturally talented will succeed. Okay, that probably sounds accurate, right? But there might be something a little more sinister behind that, because what are they implying about those that don't succeed? That they're not smart, that they're not talented, that they don't know how to work hard. That was certainly not the case for a lot of these workers during the Gilded Age making low salaries. A lot of it is based on your circumstances and how you get into business in the first place, right? Take a look, and we're going to hit pause, or you can hit pause on this, and go ahead and read this document real quick, and we'll talk about it. Okay, good. I'm glad you looked at it. Hopefully, you noted some stuff. So, this is the Gospel of Wealth. This is from Andrew Carnegie. And what he's saying in here, especially down towards the bottom, is that being wealthy is not a bad thing. He says that actually shows that God is favoring those, like we just talked about, who are successful. Carnegie's, however, going to have a different take on what to do with the money. He says that people should use their money to help those less fortunate. In fact, Carnegie thought it was sinful to die with a lot of money in the bank. He was really one of those you should give it all away before you die type of people. And Carnegie will do things like fund the building of libraries all throughout the United States and even in other parts of the world. He'll help found a university, and he'll also build the famous performing arts venue, Carnegie Hall, in New York City, as he felt the arts benefited society. He'll also use it for other philanthropic scenarios across the United States. Now, a critique of these people is that they're robber barons. They, of course, don't like that name because we can hear the negative connotations. They preferred the euphemism captains of industry. If you hear a robber baron, right, it sounds like somebody who got their money through shady means. Captains of industry makes them sound more industrious, right? Some of the shady things they did, unfair labor practices, they would do things like take a loss on what they're selling because they had such deep pockets they could afford that loss for 6 months, a year, or longer. And in that meantime, their competitors who didn't have as much money would often run out and eventually go bankrupt, right? At that point, they would swoop in, they'd buy out that other competitor, that horizontal integration, and then they could raise their prices back up to whatever they wanted to, right? So that's one of the sneaky things they did. Factories were very dangerous places to work at this time. The loss of life was pretty extreme. And we'll talk about that right now. So, factory floor. People are usually working 6 days a week. The idea of a 5-day work week was not a thing in the late 1800s. They're working a minimum of 12 hours, sometimes 14 hours a day. 60-hour weeks, work weeks were the standard. Check out the fatalities there. So, in 1882, 675 people died each week in industrial accidents. That's each week. Contrast that to today. The United States is, of course, 10 times the size? And we only have 97 deaths. Now, that's still a huge amount of deaths, right? But the amount of deaths per capita per worker was extreme. There are no safety standards yet. Those won't come up for a few more decades, and we'll talk about that when we get to the progressive era. Labor was very mind-numbing, very repetitive, and there were no benefits. If you injured yourself at work, if you lost an arm or a limb, you simply lost your job. They would say, well, sorry, you should have been more careful. Good luck, go do something else. And so people are often injured and then destitute because they have no other way to make money. And then you can probably see down there how, what the pay rate was. So men are making, $1.20 something a day? Women a little under $1 a day, and children 27 cents a day. Now think about that. Why would they pay children so much less? Kids don't know how to protest, right? How to bargain, how to organize, and so they're often faced with these very low wages. Okay, so female workers counted for 20% of the industry by 1900. They're mainly working in textile factories in the garment industry. So they're not producing heavy machinery during this time period. They're really confined to the textile industry, which had been the case since the Lowell mills back in the early 1800s. We can see nearly 2 million children were working in factories. There's dangerous conditions, and of course, if they're working in a factory, where are they not? They're not in school. And so we have on the image a fake Gilded Age person from one of my favorite shows, Ghosts, who's often talking about how much she loved child labor because she could get more out of the children for much less money. Reform movements will begin during this time period, but they won't really take off again until the Progressive Era. All right, so looking at cities, and we'll have a separate lecture on cities. So this is just um, a quick intro or a quick recap. But cities are growing in population because people are coming to cities as they immigrate to America. There are people that had been working in the agricultural industry that are now coming back to the cities because they're being replaced by new and more efficient farm machinery. So there is no need for them working. And of course, in the cities, 20% of people were at or below the poverty line, but that number will actually be much higher in certain cities. All right, so what can workers do? So you have these low wages, you have these unsafe conditions. What would you do if you were in charge? How could you organize your fellow workers? Okay, well, one thing you could do is you could boycott. You could say, I'm simply not buying this product because I know that this place uses unsafe practices. If you think today, right, a lot of people might have a personal boycott of certain items. Maybe you don't buy makeup from somewhere because you know they test on animals, right? There will be sympathy demonstrations. As unions form, one union might support another union that's on strike in a totally different industry. So perhaps the Teamsters, the people who are driving the horse-drawn wagons to deliver things, they might strike in sympathy with people working in a steel factory, for example. There's picketing. There's organized strikes. That's probably the most obvious thing when we think of how do unions get what they want. But then there's also what are called wildcat strikes, where the workers themselves spontaneously, without the leadership telling them to do so, go on strike. Obviously, business owners are not going to like any of these things. So what will they do? Well, if there's a strike, one thing they'll do is they'll use scabs. Scabs are replacement workers that you bring in. They're paid less money. They're not in a union, so they're not going to bargain. Oftentimes, they're the most desperate people who would be willing to take a super low paying job just because they had to. Businesses will use PR campaigns, especially later on, to paint unions as socialists and communists when those philosophies emerge. There are detective agencies that they use to investigate and basically mess with unions, kind of go undercover, plant some seeds of doubt. They can lock out their workers. That's when a factory closes before the workers can go on strike. So it's almost like they're closing up the factory because they want to make sure that the people who are working get desperate enough to where they need to take the lower jobs. And one thing they also have is called yellow dog contracts. This is a factory where they'd say, we will employ you only if you do not work in a union. If you do work, or if you do join a union, you can't work here. So like we said, undercover detective agencies, the Pinkertons, one of the first kind of private investigating firms ever in the United States. They get famous when they supposed plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln, and they grow into this national corporation where they have these detectives all around the United States. The business owners hire them to find out what's going on with the unions. Kind of an early union were called the Molly Maguires. They weren't officially a union, but they were secret society of Pennsylvania coal miners that were trying to get better conditions for themselves. And then we have something called the National Labor Union. It's very small, it does not last long, but it's a very first attempt at unionizing workers. So the real beginning, I guess you would say, of unions were the Knights of Labor. These are the things that they wanted. So in just 20 years, they'll peak at 700,000. This is nationwide. These are demands. Which of these do we have today? I think most of us think these are good ideas, right? Especially if you're a worker. Now, if you're a business owner, you're not going to like that. But today we do have an 8-hour workday. In some industries, we have cooperatives. Some companies are employee owned. Child labor will be abolished eventually. We'll talk more about the financial side of things in another lecture in terms of greenbacks. Sadly, we still don't have equal pay for women as we do for men. We do have safety codes. There are a lot of industries where foreign labor is encouraged, such as maybe migrant farm workers. But then, of course, we know with recent political debates, this issue of guest workers, people who have come to the United States, can still become an issue. All right, so a few strikes. First is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This is a strike that starts by railroad workers, and it, it spreads throughout the country. And railroad workers go on strike. Other unions join them, like we said, in sympathy strikes. There's violence. Transportation is pretty much ground to a halt across the nation. And the government gets involved. They don't force the business owners to sit down and talk with the union. Instead, they simply force the union to go back to work. The government says, for several reasons, they can do this. One is interstate commerce. They say that the federal government, has the power to regulate, right, any business going across state lines. They also say, for example, that the mail goes across state lines and that these workers are prohibiting the mail from being delivered, which they say is a terrible offense. And so it'll be a while. It won't be until Teddy Roosevelt, about 20 years later, when a president will actually take the side of workers and not the business owners. The Homestead strike was in one of Carnegie's plants, also led to violence and death. And these clashes just show how much tension and animosity there was between workers and business owners. One protest, really, that is often called a riot, but that starts to seal the death of some labor unions occurred in Chicago. That was the Haymarket riot. The Haymarket was a physical place where there was a protest going on by labor unions. Police were brought in to break up the demonstration. There's violence with that. Someone throws a bomb, which kills a couple of police officers. And even though there's not specific evidence, they're going to blame it on anarchists. Anarchists, right? People who don't believe in a government, who maybe want more chaos. And the business owners will seize on this to blame the unions for this violence or for this. Again, they're using that public relations, that PR, to spin it against them. And this causes the Knights of Labor to lose support. Another union that starts about the same time is the Knights of Labor's decline is the American Federation of Labor. The American Federation of Labor is going to focus just on skilled workers. So it's not going to be open to somebody who's working in a factory. Simply put this part on this piece and send it on down the line. The AFL will have skilled laborers. For example, if you think of like plumbers, masons, electricians, right? Those are skilled jobs that you have to be trained for. And so they will be successful in improving the conditions. Remember, we said that a 40-hour work week was the initial goal. We can see by 1915 they still weren't at a 40-hour week, but they did bring down the average work week. The average wage of workers went up during this time. So there are some real successes that the AFL has. The American Federation of Labor is still around today. It merged with another one, and it's often called the AFL-CIO. Here's one of those situations where something looks good from afar, or maybe it looks good on paper, but then when you see it up close, it's not so nice. So George Pullman was a manufacturer, the Pullman Company, of luxury train cars. If you watch maybe a movie from the late 1800s or early 1900s, you see these opulent train cars um, with attendants, with lighting at night, which was, a real feat. And he makes a lot of money. He builds a town in his factory for his workers. So the homes look nice. He says, hey, if you work in my factory, you can live here. We provide medical needs, shops, parks. All of these things make it appear to be a great place, right? Why wouldn't you want to live here and work for Pullman? Well, it turns out he's micromanaging people. So reporters go in and they start documenting. They see how much control he has. It gets down to like, oh, what time you have to go to bed at night so that you can be able, right, to work more efficiently the next day. Didn't let people drink. Didn't let people hang out on their porches. He thought that was a bad thing. That everyone should be inside if they're not in the town square or in the park. And so um, this just kind of exemplifies where somebody may seem to be one way, but the reality might be different. He cuts wages, his workers go on strike, and like with a lot of these strikes, it results in violence and death, furthering the tension between the captains of industry or the robber barons and their workers. So, what's going to come up? We mentioned socialism earlier. Socialism is this idea of a government having control over some industries, or the people having more control. And there's someone named Eugene V. Debs who is going to run for president 5 different times. He's actually arrested, and one of the times he's running for president from jail. He obviously didn't win any of the times. We've never heard of a President Debs. But it does show how much of an appetite there was in the United States for real change. That change will have to wait a few more decades, however. Going back to this chart, we can see the rise and fall of unions. Unions began a decline in the 1980s for several different reasons, and they remain lower today than they had been since like the 1940s. That's kind of an interesting observation, something to think about. Why would that be? Okay, so what's the legacy of this time period? Well, first, the economy transformed. We went from being cultural or making things in small cottage industries to becoming one of the world's economic powerhouses and manufacturing houses during this time. These abuses will set the foundation or the need for reform. And then there's a new social order. During this time period, there is a huge gap between the rich and the poor. We start to have a middle class, which was unique for almost the first time in American history. The middle class starts to grow, and that's something that will continue throughout the 1900s and even today. Thank you all for watching.